Welcome to the return of the Lighting the Lamp podcast. For many years, Dr. Tim Jenny produced this podcast and did a wonderful job. He's no longer with us, but we wanted to continue, but with a different format. Going forward, we'll have interviews, we'll have features on new titles and products that Accordance is releasing. Today I have with me David Lane. And now, David, you had left the company and now you've returned because you couldn't stay away. Is that correct?
Couldn't stay away. One of the reasons was because I get to work on fun stuff like I'm going to show you today. So.
Well, I'm glad you're back because I can't imagine Accordance without David Lane.
Well, thank you.
So one of the first projects that you've been working on since you've been back is our new timeline, Accordance Timeline Expanded Edition.
Yep.
So tell us what's new in this expanded edition.
It kind of grew out of something that we'd intended to do for a long time, which was to go from, the original timeline had biblical history, and we wanted to add church history and religious history of various groups. And so we've actually had this in the works for years, but it's just never really made it to the top of the priority list. And so we finally made it a priority and got into it. And my original intention was to add a few hundred church history dates and go from there. But we realized that to show church history, you have to show world history. And so we've ended up tripling the size of the timeline, adding thousands of new items and adding descriptions of all of the items on the timeline. So there's new features in biblical history, but there's also 1,500 years of world history past what the previous timeline did.
And there's new regions too, like the original timeline had Israel and Egypt and Syria and so forth. There are new regions in this expanded timeline,
right?
Correct?
So we added regions to cover at least a place to put items anywhere in the world. So we've got the new regions are Africa, Arabia, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and then we have a world region which basically covers what's left, which is the Americas, Oceania, which is the South Pacific Islands and Australia, India, and then China. So we've got at least a place for any kind of item that you would want to add to the timeline.
So it's still customizable?
Absolutely, yeah. You can add your own dates and your own items. You can customize the look of the timeline, the number of items that appear, and so on.
Well, great. I'm ready to jump in and have you show us in a quick demo of what's new in the Accordance Timeline Expanded Edition.
All right, sounds good. Let's do it. Okay, so here we have the new expanded timeline, and you can see right now we're zoomed in on Israel. It looks very much like the old timeline. We have a number of different items that are shown on the timeline, and they are items of different kinds. So there are rulers, prophets, individuals, writings, and events. And those 5 have all been in the previous timeline, but we've added a 6th category for religious leaders, and you can see them up here. These are people that are holding some kind of ecclesiastical or religious or priestly office. And so in biblical times, it's the Hebrew priests. In later periods, it'll be popes and patriarchs and various other religious leaders. So one of the key things to understand about these different types of items is that individuals plots the course of a person's life, their lifespan. And so here we can zoom in on David as an individual, and we get the period of his life. But the other items, like rulers and prophets and religious leaders, focus on the length of that individual's reign or their term in office or their period of ministry. So here, David as a ruler shows the dates of his actual reign. And another new thing that you can see right away, when I click on an item, not only do I get the name of that item and its dates and the relevant scripture references, but we now include a description. So you can look at each of these items and say, well, who's Gad? And click and find out that he was the prophet who served David during his flight from Saul. So you have descriptions, that's new. You have religious leaders, that's new. Let me switch the number of items that are shown on the timeline so I can focus on the new regions. So you can control which items and which regions are displayed up here at the top part of the timeline. And I'm going to switch to rulers just to condense the timeline down a little bit, not give me so much information. And here we can see a little easier the various regions that are now available. We have Africa, and Africa is divided into subregions. You can have as many as 4 different subregions in a region. And so here we have sub-Saharan Africa, and then basically the area around Carthage, and then Libya bordering Egypt. And then you have Egypt, Israel, Palestine, Aram, Syria, that's what we've had before, and then another new one is Arabia. So we now have Arabia divided into areas like Northwest Arabia, which tends to figure more prominently in ancient history than the rest of the Arabian Peninsula, until you get to the Islamic period, and then you start to see events and rulers in the Islamic period and beyond. So we have Arabia, Mesopotamia, Persia, Asia, Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, Greece, and then Rome/Italy. Now that we've gone beyond the fall of the Roman Empire, we also have that region dedicated to Italy, which after the fall of the Roman Empire splits into 4 and really more different segments. And then we have Eastern Europe, and we've got that basically divided into the Russian steppe, and then the Balkans, the southern Balkans south of the Danube, and then the area north of the Danube, basically Bulgaria, ancient Bulgaria. Modern Bulgaria is actually south of the Danube, but ancient Bulgaria and Hungary. And then finally the Polish plain, the North Central European plain, modern-day Poland. And then we have Western Europe. In Western Europe, we divided broadly into Germany, France, Spain, and the British Islands. And we obviously couldn't devote a sub-region to everything, so you would, if you're adding items to the timeline, you'd put them as close to the right spot. So, for example, in Western Europe, when we're dealing with the Netherlands, that will be in the area around Germany. If you're dealing with Portugal, it's going to be in the area devoted to Spain, and so on. And then finally, we have a world history region. Let me go toward the modern period so you can see this. And so we've got the world region divided into the Americas, into Oceania, East Asia, so the Far East, and then India. And so there's now a place, at least, for every kind of item that we would want on the timeline. And then let me show you how you can change the regions that you display on the timeline. So, for example, if I wanted to compare, say, Israel and Mesopotamia. Well, Israel is separated normally from Mesopotamia by Aram and Arabia, and so it's sometimes hard to track what's going on between those two regions. And I'm going to switch the items here to show a few more items. Let's do rulers, individuals, and events. And now, by choosing Israel and Mesopotamia, I get just those two regions, and I can compare what's happening in each of those regions at any given point in time. And of course, another old feature of the timeline is the fact that the color of a region spills over onto other regions when the people of that region dominate the people of another region. So here we see the blue of Mesopotamia during the Assyrian Empire spilling over into the northern kingdom of Israel, but Judah maintained some degree of independence. And then in the Neo-Babylonian period, we go all the way to Judah being conquered by Mesopotamia. So you can see the ebb and flow of various empires by looking at the various political periods on the timeline. All right, so we've talked about the new regions. We've talked a little bit about the new item, the religious leaders item. And we've talked about the descriptions that are available. Now I want to show you what I think is one of the coolest new features of the timeline. And let me go to all regions. And let's go down to the period of David. And let's zoom in here a little bit. So I'm going to click on David as an individual, so that gives his lifespan. And we've got the events of his life here and so on. Well, we've got the description of his life. But what if I want to see everything that's happening on the timeline during the period of David's life? Well, now in the description popover, we can click this little icon here to get the timeline data report. Now, you could previously get this report by clicking in the date bar up here, but it was kind of a hidden feature. We've now made it obvious by putting it in that little popover. And the timeline data report will list everything that's going on during the years represented by David's life. So from 1041 to 971, this is what's happening on the timeline. In the world region, you're in the Zhou dynasty of China, and pre-colonial Oceania and America, pre-Columbian Americas, and the Vedic period in India. In Western Europe and Eastern Europe, really, there's stuff happening, but it's not recorded history, so it's not on the timeline. And then in Rome, Italy, the Latins are just beginning to settle. In Greece, you're in the Dark Age, and notice how this report now becomes much more informative because it includes the descriptions which have been added to each item. So previously to the new expanded timeline, you would just see Dark Age. And you'd go, well, what is that? What Dark Age is that? But now it explains during the Bronze Age collapse, Greek civilization rapidly declines. And in Asia Minor, you've got Neo-Hittite states. After the Bronze Age collapse, the Hittite Empire fragments into splinter states. And if we look at Mesopotamia, we see that Assyria is in decline because of an influx of Arameans that's destabilizing things. And so, if we go down to Egypt, we'll see Egypt's in the third intermediate period. So we can see at a glance that David is ruling at a time when the whole region of the Mediterranean is destabilized. There's been this collapse that has led to instability everywhere, and David is one of these little states that is building a little empire and filling the power vacuum that's there. So the addition of the descriptions, I think, is a really helpful teaching tool, especially in conjunction with this timeline data report. All right, well, I really haven't shown you the new scope of the timeline, so let's change this to rulers, just to show us a little more at a glance. And let me zoom way out and show you what we now have available as opposed to what we had before. So previously with the old timeline, we had basically about what you see, well, I'd have to zoom out a little further, but basically here up through the fall of the Roman Empire. So to around 500 AD. But now we go all the way to the modern period, 2020, And so we have modern events, and we have all of those different additional regions. So there's a lot more of world history that's available on the timeline. So let's show all items, and let's do a search for something like, well, let's do something kind of interesting. I'm going to do a search for the Hinnoticon. Now, prior to doing this, the research for the timeline, I didn't even know what the Hinnoticon was. And here it is. The Hinnoticon is a decree by the Emperor Zeno, now that's the Byzantine Emperor Zeno, which attempted to solve the Miaphysite controversy by minimizing the definition of Chalcedon, one of the causes of the Acacian Schism. That's a mouthful, but it relates to a number of other items on the timeline, like the Acacian Schism. What is that? That's a schism between the Western and Eastern churches during the Miaphysite controversy, begun when Pope Felix III excommunicated Patriarch Acacius of Constantinople. And then we can say, okay, well, where's this Patriarch Acacius? And here we can click on that item. So there's a whole detailed history of church history events, and we've tried to go beyond, we have a tendency in the West to get narrower and narrower in our focus on history, and more Western in our focus on history. And so we've really tried to focus on adding Eastern Orthodox dates and tracking some of the controversies and schisms that split the Western and Eastern churches. We've covered some of the Nestorian churches and what was happening after the Council of Chalcedon. And we've tried to cover other religious history as well. Let's do a search for Hillel. So here we find Hillel the Elder, and I can click on that. It's Hillel was a Jewish rabbi and founder of a school whose teachings are recorded in the Mishnah. The Hillel school tended to be less strict than the rival school of Shammai. And of course we've got Shammai here. We also have Herodian individuals and rulers at the time. This is around the time of the New Testament. And, well, actually that's a little before the New Testament period. And we have other Jewish rabbis and events in Christian history and Jewish history, Islamic history, and so on. So there's a ton of new information that's available. The Reformation period is covered in some detail. The Crusades are covered in a great deal of detail. And so there's tons of new information on the timeline. I could show you a lot more, but this is supposed to be a short demo, so I better stop there. And well, I will show you one other thing, and that's, let me close the timeline here, and I'm just going to open up the biblical text, and we'll go to Genesis 22. And here we have the story of the binding of Isaac. And we can, of course, amplify to the timeline, as we've been able to do, by selecting the name Abraham or Isaac, and then going to the Amplify button and choosing Timeline. And that will actually bring up a list, because there are now Abrahams that are very far away from the biblical Abraham in both time and place, like Abraham Lincoln and Abraham Kuyper. We can choose which of these Abrahams we want to find. So I'm going to choose the biblical Abraham, and there we find Abraham. And we've been able to do that before, but one of the things that's new is we can now select a scripture reference and amplify to the timeline. So let's amplify to the timeline again. And here we see the binding of Isaac, And Sarah gets found because Sarah is covered in the chapters that include Genesis 22. Isaac is found because he's also covered in the chapters from 21 to 35, so he's included in Genesis 22. And then the specific story of the binding of Isaac is found by searching the scripture reference, not the actual individual's name. So that makes the timeline much more useful from the biblical text. And we can also access that by going and adding the info pane to the biblical text. And you'll see under topics, we now have timeline. We've had that before, and it would list a few items by name. But now it's listing a lot more items because it's finding all of the items on the timeline that relate to this verse that we're looking at. So there are lots of nice enhancements and lots of new information in the timeline, and I could spend all day showing it to you, but I better stop there.
Well, thank you, David, for showing us the new Accordance Timeline Expanded Edition. I know I can't wait to jump right in and start using it myself, and I know that our users will be ready to do that as well.
All right. Well, thanks, Rick.
Thank you, David.